Welcome everyone to Dropkick Discussions presented by Sportskeeda. I'm your host Korey Gunz along with Sportskeeda's wrestling expert Tom Colohue. And this week we're talking major Raw rewrites, the debut of Keith Lee, and we're celebrating the 1-year anniversary of the Dropkick Discussions podcast. But let's start the show with the biggest news coming out of SummerSlam weekend, and that is the return of Roman Reigns. Tom, I was as surprised as anyone to see the big dog make his presence felt at SummerSlam on Sunday. What details can you give us about Reigns' return here after being out of action for about 4 months?
Well, it was quite a big surprise, certainly. I'm very impressed with the fact that the WWE managed to keep it quiet for so long as well. Roman has been in constant contact for the last few weeks with the WWE, who've been giving him a lot more safety assurances and letting him know plans way ahead of anyone else in the company. The Fiend and Braun Strowman didn't know until just before the match that Roman Reigns was going to be there. They knew how the match was going to go. They were told just beforehand, at the end, Roman Reigns is going to come out, beat you up, you're just going to lay down and take it. Whereas Roman knew about the ThunderDome months before anyone else knew about the ThunderDome. Right now, he feels safe returning. They did a great job keeping it quiet. A major part of that is the only people claiming to have known about it all seem to have said it after the fact. So either they're respecting the spoiler and trying to keep it quiet, same as anyone else, or they're just trying to get the credit for it.
Now, I know you just mentioned that Braun Strowman and The Fiend had no idea that Roman Reigns was going to be there up until right before the match. But backstage, in the writing team's mind, was Roman Reigns coming back here? Was this the plan for the climax of the Fiend-Braun match all along? Or was this a little bit more of a hotshot booking just since Roman said, hey, I'm ready to come back? They said, hey, let's get him out there as soon as possible. SummerSlam's a big show. That's as good as any time to, have him come back and make an appearance.
It was a bit of both. The plan between WrestleMania and SummerSlam was exactly this, with The Fiend claiming the championship at SummerSlam. After that, they would have had to write up some new ideas, and they were certainly pitching ideas in the creative room and passing ideas back and forth. There wasn't any formal plan for Roman to return because they didn't know for certain that they could convince him to return. When they did, they planned this out. It was hot-shotted in a way, but at the same time, they did follow a plan to get here.
As much shock value as Roman's return was, I gotta admit, I was bummed that there was no real closure to this Braun Strowman Fiend Alexa Bliss storyline. They had done such a good job, and we talked about on the podcast last week that especially on last week's episode of SmackDown and then also the week prior with all the Alexa Bliss stuff, that they'd really kind of hooked me back in to this story. And I know, especially on social media, a lot of people were anticipating that the finale, the climax to this match at SummerSlam would probably include Alexa Bliss in some form or fashion. Was she going to come out and help The Fiend? Would she come out and help Braun Strowman? And instead of really having a close to that story arc, we just kind of get the surprise and wow factor of, hey, Roman Reigns is back and he's beating up everybody. Is the Fiend Braun Alexa story dead at this point in favor of moving on with Roman Reigns, or do you think that we'll still see some type of closure to that story arc at some point in the near future?
The storyline isn't dead per se. They still want to revisit it, and certainly Bray and Alexa, who was so involved in writing it, want to carry it on. A large part of this as well is how well received it's been on social media and by the fans. That's certainly going to encourage the WWE to follow it through to fruition. It has, unfortunately, definitely been pushed to one side for the moment, though, for the sake of Roman's big return. Now, his actual confirmed return was only very recently, and that's why this storyline has been pushed aside only recently. But after Payback is when we will see what really is going to happen going forwards, because obviously Payback could change a lot of things. What I will say, though, is that even if the Alexa Bliss storyline does not continue with the Universal Championship, it will continue between Alexa Bliss and Nikki Cross.
Now, maybe I was the only one kind of paying attention to this around SummerSlam, but to me, it did seem like Alexa Bliss sent out some cryptic at best tweets on Twitter around the time of SummerSlam, and to me, it seemed like maybe she was a little bit as disappointed as some of the fans about the fact that she was not involved in the SummerSlam match, or that maybe this story was being a little bit abbreviated. Have you heard anything to that effect, or just from your personal view on her social media, did you get the feeling that maybe Alexa was a little bit discouraged or a little bit disappointed that maybe some plans that they had fallen through?
Alexa Bliss is about as strong a company person as Roman Reigns is. If she was actually unhappy, there is no chance whatsoever she would state it publicly. My suggestion here is that she's playing along and making it a bit more real and breaking kayfabe a little bit for if they do decide that the storyline isn't working long term with Roman's reintroduction. Because then they can write it out, she can go back to being face again, nobody really loses. What I will say in that regard, though, is if she was annoyed, I would think that's definitely the right decision on that one, because I would be annoyed. This is a huge potential storyline, really could be a career-defining one for Alexa Bliss, and she seemed amazingly invested in it. I do believe we will see The Fiend and Alexa Bliss continue this storyline somewhere sooner rather than later, but right now it is all about Roman Reigns.
Now, all the buzz on Twitter and social media after Roman appeared on SummerSlam was this question that I want to ask you. Is Roman Reigns a heel now?
Not at all. Roman added some intensity and was intentionally out of character for the sake of the big moment. But this version of Roman Reigns isn't new. It's just Roman with an edge. We've seen it a number of times. His feud with The Undertaker, that for me was him being a heel, but it was taken at the time as just having an edge, similar to this. In addition, when Roman Reigns essentially tried to murder Braun Strowman in an ambulance, people still didn't look at that as a heel turn, which was so baffling to me at the time. We are still here. We are still at Roman Reigns with an edge, and Roman Reigns is one of those characters, much like a Charlotte Flair, much like a Finn Balor, who is simply at that plateau where his character is so well established that there is no face or heel. They can just be consistent with his character, and he doesn't have to have an alignment either way. That is a wonderful thing, because it means he can work with a face or with a heel and help them develop into characters of that ilk. That's the hope anyway. Roman Reigns is not being brought back as a heel. I can confirm that on the basis, and we'll see this come Friday when we see people who are in the ThunderDome posting recordings of the producers for their TV feed telling them to cheer Roman Reigns.
How poetic would it be, though, if they did just go full heel with Roman, that after all the years of clamoring from fans, that they would do the heel turn when there's no live audience present?
It was probably the best way to possibly do it, because you can't, at least with a live audience and how things were before this, you couldn't turn Roman Reigns heel. It wouldn't have been possible. This is my opinion on this, but this is an opinion that I've mentioned many times about Becky Lynch when they tried to turn her heel. That if you tried to turn Becky Lynch heel, you would turn Charlotte Flair heel instead. I think when it comes to Roman Reigns, fans were so desperate to see him turn heel that the second he actually did, they would start cheering so happily that Roman Reigns would turn face. Face and heel is down entirely to fan reaction. If fans are cheering, you're a face. It doesn't matter how many people you try and kill in ambulances.
Now, speaking of heels, what'd you think of some of the social media banter going back and forth between Reigns and Randy Orton?
This was great fun, I've got to say. I found it so funny. And Orton has just become so good at social media recently. It's so confusing that sort of out of nowhere, fitting to his character, he's become the most charismatic man in the known world. And Roman found it funny as well. These are two people just having fun, two leaders of the WWE just having a laugh at each other's expense. There's no actual beef there, but much like, I think my favorite interaction was probably Batista Dana Brooke. That was amazing. And for me, this is just the same as that.
Last thing on Roman before we move on, we found out on Raw on Monday that at Payback this weekend, it's going to be The Fiend defending his new Universal Championship against Braun Strowman and Roman Reigns in a triple threat. What are the odds that Roman walks out of that pay-per-view just a week after coming back. He walks out of Payback as the WWE Universal Champion. And if so, what would you think of that decision? I was going to say how poor of a decision would that be, but I'll let you kind of give your 2 cents on that. Would that be the most terrible thing that WWE could do right now at this point, is immediately shove the title back on him and start shoving him down people's throats again as the big conquering champion, especially considering how popular The Fiend is right now?
It's really hard to say because Roman has a wave of momentum and they want to capitalize on that. This is probably the most popular Roman's ever been. People really missed him. So I think at this point, he's probably the most popular man going into that match. Yes, The Fiend has been incredibly popular and The Fiend just had something of a face turn. People were told to cheer The Fiend, so it definitely was supposed to be a face turn that he had. But without Alexa Bliss, does that continue? Also, The Fiend has recovered from worse before. The Fiend had everything going on at Hell in a Cell and recovered. The Fiend had Goldberg and recovered. So I think losing here would not make people cheer Roman long term, even though it might temporarily make them believe in him a bit more. I feel the best thing they could do here would be doubling down on The Fiend. So while Roman Reigns is the obvious pick, I wouldn't be too surprised to see The Fiend retain.
I wholeheartedly agree with that opinion. I think we talked about it on the SummerSlam preview show we did for Sportskeeda on their YouTube channel. Yes, The Fiend has recovered from poor booking decisions before. I just don't know how many times he can keep doing it, so I don't want to see him be the victim of another poor decision again. And to your point, yeah, Roman's got momentum. He just made the big comeback at SummerSlam. People are happy to see him. So I think that's just another reason about why it would be a terrible decision to immediately throw the belt back on him, because then immediately all those people that are excited to see him again are going to immediately shut him out again and say, oh, well, he just now came back and now they're already, shoving him down our throats again. Let him chase the title. Let him build on that momentum. Make fans want to see him as the champion, and then I think that's the time to strike.
Completely agree. You can be patient with Roman and it will just make people more and more eager to see it. You don't have to force it, and unfortunately WWE are in the habit of doing that.
Well, let's move on now. Roman Reigns makes his return to the WWE, and then on Monday we saw the debut, if you want to call it that, to the main roster, or at least the Raw debut of former NXT champion Keith Lee. Now, first thing I got to ask you is, of course, his debut was announced by WWE on SummerSlam. It was announced that he was going to be on Raw, and of course this is fresh off of him dropping the NXT title just the night before. Why announce his debut beforehand instead of making it a surprise? And I know we've kind of had this debate on the show before, but remember, we're always told constantly that the WWE isn't worried about ratings. So what's the point of announcing a big debut like this beforehand instead of just making it a surprise that, hey, Keith Lee showed up on Raw and challenged Randy Orton?
This decision wasn't made in respect to ratings. Keith Lee might be a big deal in NXT, but when it comes to the main roster, he's not a proven draw. So this wasn't done for ratings. There wasn't a concern for ratings when it comes to Keith Lee's debut. He was officially announced for a couple of reasons. Now, yes, it'll pop a rating with NXT fans, but it really wasn't done with ratings in mind. There were some concerns after TakeOver, both internally in WWE and from social media and fandom, that Keith Lee might be lost in the shuffle and lacking direction if he stayed in NXT after TakeOver. This also played into the injury to Karrion Kross, which suggested, maybe Keith Lee will get it back. They wanted to put paid to that pretty quickly. They looked ahead, expected people might lose a bit of faith in Keith Lee, and decided to make sure the news got out quickly. It certainly got a big buzz from fans of NXT, and in addition, it's a moment in SummerSlam, a jam-packed and high-quality SummerSlam, that people still remember because they managed to fit a lot of news into SummerSlam and TakeOver as well that got wrestling journalism talking as well as the fans talking.
Did you think that they are announcing Keith Lee's debut beforehand cheapened Kross's title win the night before in any way? And what I mean by that is, Saturday night, Karrion Kross gets the title, and you think, oh, wow, they've really pushed this guy to the moon on NXT. Keith Lee, he didn't have too long of a reign with the title. He beats Adam Cole, becomes a double champion. Now his very first big defense, he drops the title. And then the next night on SummerSlam, we see Keith Lee's coming to Raw. So in my mind as a fan, it's almost like, oh, well, they're bringing him up to the main roster, so he had to drop the title, and he had to drop it to somebody, so I guess Kross was the pick. He was just kind of there, right place, right time, as opposed to it's feeling like Kross got the title because of how over he's gotten in a short amount of time. So did you think, am I overthinking things a little bit here? Did you think that by announcing Keith Lee coming up to Raw beforehand that it kind of cheapened or lessened Kross's win at TakeOver in any way?
I wouldn't say it cheapened it or lessened it. If anything, it makes it look as though Keith Lee lost so badly he literally ran away from the injured man. Because he lost clean. Karrion Kross has been pushed hard and been winning clean. He's been getting huge wins. He destroyed Tommaso Ciampa. In many ways, he destroyed Keith Lee. So I wouldn't say this cheapened it at all. NXT do need to move some of the top names on in order to push people slightly lower down the card to a higher degree. They haven't been doing that because they wanted to keep hold of people to compete with AEW. That has changed recently. They are not that concerned about competing anymore. And that is why people like Keith Lee, maybe Johnny Gargano, can be looking at moving to the main roster. Their focus right now, because of ratings going down, is Raw and SmackDown. Keith Lee's there to help that by filling out Raw a little bit so it doesn't have to constantly be having the same divisions and the same rematches upon rematches upon rematches, or in the case of Sasha Banks and Asuka, rematch upon rematch upon rematch upon rematch upon rematch.
The biggest thing that got Twitter all flustered on Monday, and that's the fact that Keith Lee showed up with new music and new ring attire. Now, to me, this isn't that huge of a deal. I didn't think the music change is that big of an issue. I'm not a fan of the attire simply because I think those shorts or a skort, whatever it is that he's wearing, it just looks way too baggy. I know a lot of people said it looked like he was wearing a dress or wearing a skirt, and I tend to agree with them there. But people on social media were highly upset about this. Why does WWE make this habit of when they bring someone up from NXT, they have to change them in some way or somehow? Why can't they just let Keith Lee be Keith Lee, wear the same thing he's had on in NXT, have the same theme music? Why did they feel like they needed to make these changes?
There's a number of reasons for this. Vince likes to make sure there's something of a clean slate between NXT and the call-up, and a large part of that is to get the audience talking. So essentially, the WWE proper believe that what he has now is better than what he had on NXT. So they expected people on social media to say, oh, this is great, this is great. And as part of that is like, oh, this music's new, it's exciting, let's get people talking, let's make sure Keith Lee trends. And Keith Lee did trend, just not necessarily for the reasons that they were going for.
Yeah.
I know this is a habit of Vince McMahon's. I know that you're not a big fan of the sword sounds at the beginning of Drew McIntyre's theme.
Yes. Oh my gosh.
We've talked about this before with it's funny that we talked about this just before they added the sword sounds, but the bullet ricochets at the beginning of Ricochet's theme, the creak when Aleister Black used to lift up in his chair. This is all Vince McMahon trying to freshen things up, trying to make it appeal to a new audience. And I think it's very telling that when it comes to this new attire, it was approved by Keith Lee. This isn't something where he's come up to the main roster and said, okay, you're wearing this today. It's been made a couple of weeks ago. He was fully aware of it, and he's approved it.
It's still one of my favorite podcast quotes that we've ever had when we talked about the bullet sounds being added to Ricochet's theme, and you said Vince McMahon added the bullet sounds to better relate to children. That still is like one of my favorite just little tidbits. I don't know why that makes me laugh so much, but it just does.
And it's 100% true. I remember we talked about Jeff Hardy and his whole storyline with Sheamus being to try and hide information in SEO and Google rankings. And then a couple of weeks later, we get the greatest wrestling match ever, which was literally done for the Google and SEO rankings to make sure that people would only find WWE when searching for the greatest wrestling match ever. We follow the trends here. And if anything, we're ahead of the trend.
Now, this is going to be a really superficial question, but I do feel like there's enough evidence to ask it, and I feel like this is just kind of where we are right now. Yeah. One of the attire changes to Keith Lee was the fact that he's wrestling in a shirt now. Is this because Vince thinks he's too fat?
I haven't been told that. That's not something I'm personally aware of. We constantly hear rumors of, Vince thinks this person's too big or this person's too big. And yet he continues to push people who maybe are on the slightly larger side of the scale. I'm not going to name names. I don't think that's fair on anyone. But in this particular instance, some of the people that Vince McMahon is the biggest fan of are those larger gentlemen. And really, as long as they can go in the ring, Vince is not known to care.
Well, we heard on Monday's Raw that at Payback we're going to see a rematch from what we saw on Raw, which is going to be Keith Lee against Randy Orton. Is this just kind of a fodder match so that they keep Drew McIntyre and Randy Orton apart for this pay-per-view? And what are your expectations for Keith Lee on Raw, not only just at Payback, but moving forward? Do you see him, is it going to be he's going to get squashed by Orton and then maybe fall to the mid-card, or do they have high hopes for him on Raw? What are your expectations for Keith Lee now that he's on the main roster?
There is going to be no squash from Orton. Keith Lee will be very unlikely to win this match, but he will come out of it looking good. My expectation for the match is that it'll go exactly the same way it did on Raw, with McIntyre returning, but maybe this time around he'll be able to make it so that Keith Lee wins. I can't see Keith Lee losing both of his debut matches, both on Raw and on pay-per-view, but it's not unheard of. In NXT, you always lose your first match and then work your way up. That's the way Triple H likes to do it, and Triple H has more and more control over the overall product as time goes on. For the long term, I don't think Keith Lee is going to be straight into the championship picture. I think he's there to fill out the mid-card a little bit. That's his purpose. But that doesn't mean that they're not high on him. That doesn't mean he's not going to be going at it hammer and tongue. It doesn't mean he's not going all the way to the top. But they have learned very quickly not to put people straight to the top, because that tends to really wind up the people who are already at the top, who spent years trying to get there. And it even more annoys people who are in the mid-card, particularly those who have come from NXT, to have someone brought in who was working under them in NXT, to have them brought in immediately above them. So there is a certain amount of politics going on. There always will be in something like this. I think Keith Lee has a very bright future. I think Survivor Series showed that. I just think it'll take him a little time to get there. He has to pay some dues, and there is nothing wrong with that.
Let's move on to Retribution, which had a very heavy influence and heavy presence on Raw this past Monday, especially with their attack of Rey Mysterio and Dominik. How long do you think it'll be until we get some sort of reveal from this Retribution angle? Maybe not that we're going to find out who the leader is, but maybe some of the members of the group will be revealed or unmasked. What do you think kind of the timeline is that we get past just the random masked attacks on Raw and SmackDown?
I think it'll still be a while yet. I think we're looking at closer to Survivor Series, at least in and around after the draft, because I don't feel once you unmask someone, they can then be drafted. And I don't think they want the visual of Retribution members being drafted to Raw or to SmackDown. So it will definitely be after the draft. However, when it comes to Retribution, plans are all over the place at the minute, and they're being rewritten practically every week. Nothing has been rewritten more than when and where Retribution show up. There are times when the people playing Retribution are sat backstage waiting for hours with rewrites upon rewrites upon rewrites, and there are times when people have left who are going to be playing Retribution characters, and they've had to bring other people in to fill those spots. There's a quite open argument backstage at the moment about how much to use them. Some want them in nearly every segment. They want to push them hard. Others don't want to see them at all and don't support Retribution as a group. A large part of this is that there are definitely some political connotations, so some people feel very uneasy about the presence of Retribution at all.
I do want to backtrack just a minute and talk about Dominik's debut at SummerSlam. How impressed were you with what you saw on Sunday night?
I was very impressed, I've got to say. I have been hearing for over a year now how great Dominik is going to be when he steps into the ring. I know we've been talking about it a lot on this podcast. We've been way ahead of the curve when it comes to Dominik. The street fight format was advantageous, but Raw really gave him a chance to show a bit more standard wrestling, and that tag team match was very high-paced. Like, when it comes to tag team matches, you sometimes get really high-paced matches. New Day and Usos were always infamous for starting hot. But this match, they didn't have too long. They had 10 or so minutes before everything went, and they filled that time. Constant action. Hopefully, the Retribution attack means we're moving on from Seth Rollins now, and Rey and Dominik will be moving into other feuds. We'll see. I don't think Dominik will ever get his win back, or at least won't get it back anytime soon, so I wouldn't be pushing for it. But I was impressed. I feel he's got a bright future ahead of him, and he certainly is living up to expectations.
Now, we heard on Raw Monday that another match made official for Payback is going to be Dominik and Rey Mysterio teaming up to take on Seth Rollins and Buddy Murphy, which is something I think we probably all expected at this point. Do you think, though, that this will be Rey Mysterio's last WWE appearance?
There was definitely a time when he wanted it to be his last appearance, and not just in WWE, but he wanted to retire, and he's on record as saying that. There are rumors now that Rey Mysterio has signed a 3-year contract. This is quite confusing to me because he has been adamant in negotiations that he doesn't want to sign anything long-term. If that's happened, they must have promised him a hell of a lot, and I would not be too surprised if Dominik was a champion sooner rather than later.
You think that's a bargaining chip that Rey has? Is like, hey, I'll sign an extension if you make Dominik the United States champion? Or, I mean, do you think that's something he could actually have written in his contract?
It wouldn't be written in his contract. It would be a promise that was made. It would be a gentleman's agreement, as it were.
Right.
But yeah, that has been part of negotiations. That's why we haven't heard anything about a contract being signed yet. That's why we had the singles match before we got to the tag match. The most important thing to Rey Mysterio right now in his career is Dominik Mysterio and the push that he is getting. So if he is signed for a long-term deal, he'll be in and around Dominik the whole time.
Interesting. Now, I do want to ask you about Raw in general. Any truth to the report that Vince McMahon showed up to the show less than an hour before showtime and just changed just about everything about the show at the last minute?
Completely true to my knowledge. I have multiple sources saying so, and that's before we get to whatever sources the rumors in question have originated from. But at the same time, they knew it was going to happen. The creative team were fully aware that Vince McMahon was going to turn up and start ripping things up. As it was described to me a couple of hours beforehand, the show was always going to be chaotic because they desperately needed matches at Payback, and they hadn't announced any because they had only planned about half a card out. That's why they dropped Orton versus McIntyre, which was supposed to be on that card, and put Keith Lee in. That was Vince doing that. Raw Underground is all pre-taped. That suffered major cuts too. Shane McMahon really wasn't happy about that, but he's at the mercy of the editors at the moment, because when it comes to live things, you look at, for example, the Lana and Natalya versus Mickie James segment. Mickie James has been rewritten every week since she returned, and she's gotten less and less and less of a role each time. Shane McMahon's Raw Underground is something that he felt was going to be protected, but because that's not live, it is the easiest thing to cut down, and also because it generally does not feature big name stars who are likely to be at pay-per-views. They decided to cut out everything that didn't feature someone who was going to be featuring on the Payback card. That's why we got so much of a focus on Lashley. Shane wasn't happy, but he understood. And honestly, for me, I don't think it was a bad show, but I think there were certainly some things that worked against itself, and the chaos and the hectic nature isn't always the right move like Vince often thinks it is.
Yeah, I think there were points in the show where you could definitely tell that maybe things were put together a little bit last minute, or they weren't exactly sure what direction they were going to go with things, or when certain segments were going to air in the show and things like that. So I think it was a little bit noticeable this past Monday. Now, before we move on, I do want to ask you, you mentioned that Shane McMahon wasn't happy about the cuts to Raw Underground, and we've talked on previous episodes that Shane has had a lot more creative influence on Raw lately and has gotten a lot of support backstage. A lot of people seem to really like some of the ideas he's been bringing forth, like Raw Underground. We saw in the WWE 24 documentary that he was involved in producing the Firefly Funhouse match at WrestleMania. And then kind of piggybacking off what me and you discussed a couple weeks ago, we saw reports that there were rumors that Shane McMahon may become the head of Raw, kind of take over that position that Paul Heyman previously had, and so that then Bruce Pritchard can kind of focus on SmackDown or maybe become more of a liaison between the brands and kind of just execute Vince's vision for what he sees for Raw and SmackDown. Could you see Shane McMahon becoming kind of the head writer or the head of creative for the Raw brand?
We've been talking about Shane McMahon for a while, as you've alluded to there, and talking about the fact that so many of his creative ideas have been taken on board. We've had a few people come out, wrestlers and people who work backstage at the WWE, stating that they love working with Shane McMahon. They love the intensity of thought. They love how integral he is to everything, how he is constantly working at everything, much like his father does, or at least did. I wasn't able to confirm the story that he was going to be considered to take over Raw. It has been disputed since, and it was originally only the one source when it was initially reported. I haven't been able to confirm it. I believe one day we will see that. However, at the moment, we don't seem to be there just yet. I think Shane McMahon feels he has a lot to prove, and he is proving it extremely well. But at the moment, it's difficult for him because he has to really prove himself above and beyond because of his surname.
Well, let's move on to a couple of quick hitters and kind of get your thoughts on some of these things, and then we'll wrap up the show here. First, we saw on Raw Aleister Black, who I've been a big proponent of and a big fan of here on the show. Apparently had his own heel turn on Monday. He kicked Kevin Owens in the face during the Kevin Owens show. What did you make of this, and what would be your feelings on a heel Aleister Black?
I think it's a very good decision. I think it's very good news. I spoke about this in the Raw preview on Sportskeeda's Facebook. That happens at 5 p.m. UK time, which is 12 noon Eastern Standard Time in the US. And in that, I was able to explain that, yes, Aleister Black is going to be turning heel on this upcoming Raw. So we knew it was coming. It opens up a lot of options. Firstly, yes, Kevin Owens, but it also opens up options such as Apollo Crews. And the major one for me is we could potentially get Drew McIntyre versus Aleister Black down the road. I feel they needed that mid to top level heel, particularly with Seth Rollins so tied up in so many different storylines and Bobby Lashley having already had his moment. I feel Aleister Black could really go across the levels, could really be elevated here, and I think a lot of people will be very happy to lay down for Aleister Black now that he has had a subtle reinvention, as it were.
Yeah, if it gets Black a real push over on Raw, then I'm all for it. Now, we mentioned Karrion Kross when we were talking about NXT and talking about Keith Lee a little bit earlier. He did sustain an injury at the TakeOver event. It appears to be a separated shoulder. What can you tell us about the latest on his injury update?
Just a brief update on this one. The MRI was on Tuesday. At time of recording, it is Tuesday here, so I have no information as to the results. But if they waited that long since Saturday for the swelling to go down, it's a bad sign. With Finn Balor, they were able to complete the MRI within the first day, and they knew he would have to relinquish the title at that time. When it comes to NXT, title defenses are much more few and far between. The next takeover, to my knowledge, is booked for around October time, or at least in the build-up to Survivor Series. We're not likely to see back-to-back takeover Survivor Series and 2 nights for NXT again. So it could be that if he has an injury that puts him out for a while, he may just not defend the title at that one, and then he would be going into Survivor Series. It is a real shame if he is injured and has to relinquish the title, because I have this fantasy booking ideal in my head of The Fiend making his entrance on SmackDown, laying down the lantern on the outside, but when the lights come up, the lantern has been replaced by an hourglass. I just think that would be fantastic, and I hope that's where they're heading. I hope Karrion Kross is okay.
Yeah, I still don't know why we haven't gotten that call from WWE to be on the creative team, because it's because ideas like that, Tom, that's money.
Maybe because neither of us can say WWE most of the time. I fall over it so often. I'm so used to saying WWF back in there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but yeah, like you said, I hope he's okay. I hope they can do something. I hope he doesn't have to drop the title. SummerSlam man, is not the weekend to win titles as far as trying to avoid shoulder injuries. First it was Finn Balor, now it's Karrion Kross. So it's
Very true.
Let's talk about the Thunderdome really quick, and this is a subject that you have a lot of knowledge on. You've actually written a full article on this over on Sportskeeda.com, so you can just kind of give me the bullet points here. But WWE is having a little bit of problem with some of their online fans in the Thunderdome. Just this past week and on SummerSlam weekend, among other things, we saw a fan that was draped in Ku Klux Klan attire. We saw someone with a sign that said "Fire Velveteen Dream." We saw someone who put up a picture of Chris Benoit. What can you tell us about what WWE is doing or can do to kind of alleviate some of these problems that they're having with their virtual fans in the Thunderdome?
Well, for full details, I do recommend people read the article on Sportskeeda. If you're not sure where to find it, add me on Twitter at Colohue, Colohue, and you can find it nice and quick on there. But just for the bullet points, essentially, of the details, they are having problems. They knew they were going to have problems on these first few days. They just didn't realize they'd have these problems. They are very quickly cycling people out, but it is too slow at the minute. What they're doing, they are trying to establish a list of trusted viewers. Those people will be on screen more often than not. They will get priority sign up. And because of that, because they can trust these people not to be problematic, they'll be able to focus more on names they don't know and don't recognize, which means they won't have to monitor as many screens at once. That should reduce the likelihood of this happening, or at least happening for a long time. It's not an exact science. There are still some teething issues. They were expected, but people backstage were furious with some of these things that happened.
Last news item of the day, I want to just do a quick follow-up on Sonya Deville. We talked about her on last week's show and also on our SummerSlam preview show, but even when we recorded the SummerSlam preview, it had not been announced that her match with Mandy was going to be changed to a loser leaves the WWE match. That information came out after we had recorded, so she gets beat by Mandy. Looks like she's going to be taking some time off from the WWE. For how long, we're not exactly sure. Any update that you can give us or a follow-up just with her situation and what appears to be, at least for the time being, her last match in the WWE occurring at SummerSlam?
Well, once again, with this one, I do recommend reading the full article on Sportskeeda, but I will give bullet points here. Essentially, immediately after it became public knowledge that there had been a home invasion, Sonya Deville was contacted by the WWE and given a number of options for what she wanted to do. This is the option that she chose, and this is the option that Mandy Rose chose. There was initially some concern within the WWE that because as you become more famous, you then have that struggle whereby you are more likely to have deranged fans stalking you and obsessing over you, and you are more likely to suffer from home invasions and the like. There was some concern that she wouldn't want to come back at all. Apparently right now, after SummerSlam, people are feeling that little bit more confident because apparently she did quite enjoy her time in the ring at SummerSlam. I do hope she returns sooner rather than later. I think she's a big miss, not just on SmackDown, but in the WWE. I feel her storyline was really one of the top storylines of 2020 in wrestling. And I think she has a lot more left to offer. But if she chooses to step away, even now or for long term, I completely understand.
I did want to ask you, not to make light of the situation at all, but I saw a theory that because she's going to have to be appearing in court soon for the case against her stalker or against her attacker, that because this was going to be a hair versus hair match, and apparently she was going to be on the losing end of that stipulation as well, that her lawyers maybe thought it wouldn't exactly be a great look to have her in court with a shaved head. Is that just conspiracy theory and people kind of connecting their own dots, or is there any credence to that fact that her appearance in court would maybe in one way or another be swayed because of the fact that she might have a shaved head?
I don't know one way or the other. I can only speculate on this one. My speculation would be, if this is something that Sonya Deville was told, is it something that Sonya Deville would listen to? Because I feel Sonya Deville has made a career out of being different, out of doing what she feels is right. If she felt this was the right move, by all means, but it's not something I have heard personally. It's not something that I have the ability to research to my knowledge based on the contacts that I have. So I just have to say, I don't know.
Well, before we wrap up this episode this week, we do want to take a minute and just thank everybody for tuning in over the past year to Dropkick Discussions. This is essentially our 1-year anniversary for Tom and I on the Dropkick Discussions podcast. And to everybody's surprise, maybe most of all, Tom and I, we're still employed and we're still on the air. Yeah. So, Tom, I just want to give you a minute. Do you want to, mention anything or take a minute to comment on our 1-year anniversary here at the Dropkick Discussions podcast?
Absolutely, I do. It has been a long time. You can go back and listen to the first one if you'd like, but it is a 1.5 hour SummerSlam preview. We have gone through many iterations here. We've honed the concept, I feel, over time. We've become a little more concise. We've covered a lot more topics. But we still like to just let go and talk about wrestling and be as easy listening as we used to be back in the day sometimes. So we've recorded so many different styles of podcasts. We've broken so much news. And we owe massive thanks to everyone who has listened. For the longest time, we were really the flagship on Sportskeeda YouTube. And then based on that and how well we've done, Sportskeeda has built so much extra now. There is so much content on the Sportskeeda YouTube now, where there were times when it would only be one video a week and it would be us consistently. Us being here consistently has really helped the YouTube grow, and then in turn how the growth of the YouTube has come with everything else being added to it has really helped us grow. We're very proud of what we create, and we're very thankful that people care enough to listen to it so regularly and passionately. So thank you to everyone listening. Thank you, Korey, for pitching the idea and for hosting every week and for doing all the faffing about with audio so I don't have to.
Yeah, I want to just add on to what Tom said. I thank everybody for listening. I thank Tom for being willing to do this with me when I did pitch the idea to Sportskeeda. And, I can remember when we put up our first couple episodes, how unbelievable it was whenever we had our first show that had 1,000 views, and then when we had 3,000 views, and then we had a show that had 5,000 and then 10,000. It just continues to blow my mind, and now we're getting episodes that are getting 14 and 15,000 views. To think that many people want to tune in, and Tom's great at what he does. That's why I wanted to do the show with him. But to think that many people have actually heard my voice on YouTube is just crazy to me. So again, thank you to everyone that has listened and watched us on YouTube, and we hope that you continue to do so. Make sure that you're liking and commenting on our videos and subscribing to the Sportskeeda YouTube channel, which continues to grow. And like Tom said, I take great pride in being one of the flagships of that channel, is where we've got over 5,000 subscribers on the Sportskeeda YouTube channel at last check. So we want to continue to grow that number as well. You can subscribe to Tom's personal YouTube channel on YouTube as well, and follow him on Twitter at Colohue. I'm at Korey Gunz, and you can check out all the latest wrestling news and articles over on Sportskeeda.com. Thank you for joining us this week, and we will see you next time on the next episode of the Dropkick Discussions podcast.